I figured if I prepared you, you wouldn't be as free-flowing as you're about to be. So I think it was Marlon Brando in The Godfather that said 100 men with guns have nothing with a lawyer with a briefcase, and I've got 3 of them here to my right. So forgive me if I come across a little bit nervous of these gorgeous young men. So I've got Joey Garcia to my right from Isolas. I'm going to ask Joey to say a couple of words in a second, actually. And then Jay Gomez from Trieyes and Anthony Provasali from Hassan's. And I guess if you think about the format of this panel, there's a lot of people in this room who might be looking at Gibraltar and the DLT framework possibly to look at this jurisdiction in terms of applying for a license. So I think what I'd like to try and do is to give the guys the opportunity to explain some of the reasoning why you should consider this as a jurisdiction, some of the experiences obviously to date, and as we look forward, some of the challenges and advice that they can give you. And I think if we think about the 3 buckets, I guess, in terms of the participants, you've got the first bucket, which is really the government and the working group who effectively, with the FSC, put together this entire framework. Joey was on that working group, so I'm going to ask Joey just to maybe talk about the experience historically going right back to day one, which is probably 3 years ago or so. The second bucket are the advisors, who, if you are interested in applying for a DLT license, you would appoint and approach advisors, and these 3 are perfect candidates for that. So I think they're very well placed to talk about the framework. And thirdly, you've got users, companies like my own, GBX is in the process of applying for its own license too. And so there's a combination there of the 3 buckets. So I think just to start off with, and then what I'd like to do is to open questions later so that anybody interested in looking at Gibraltar's jurisdiction has the opportunity to ask the guys any question. But I think perhaps, Joey, you've been involved right at the, take your mic. You've been involved at the working group level really from day one. So perhaps in terms of the DLT experience, why don't we go right back and what was the thinking behind as a jurisdiction, why we should be looking at this and what approach we should take and how did we end up with the framework that we ended up with? Be a good place to start.
Sure. I mean, it's I suppose a long story, but in very brief kind of synopsis of that. If you think about groups like, I suppose, one of the original applicants in the space, which was Zappa and the Zappa group in Gibraltar under the e-money provisions, it was, to an extent, a large extent, it was them raising certain positions and concerns that existed in the industry. And all of those concerns are not that different to what exists today, i.e., what we want is absolute legal and regulatory certainty around the activities that we're conducting. And they instigated an approach and said, you know, the view that Gibraltar ultimately takes in this space may be positive, it may be negative, it may be neutral, but you should be definitely forming a view as to where you want Gibraltar to position itself. What I find absolutely amazing today is that every jurisdiction in the world is now an expert in developing regulatory frameworks in this space. The reality is that none of them have actually introduced those frameworks. So if I talk about regulatory and legal certainty at a high level being the driver of this initiative, it's a very interesting point because today you will have many, let's just say, crypto exchanges trying to operate under certain payment institution licenses or certain e-money type frameworks in different jurisdictions. Now that may be accepted by the regulator in France. It may not be accepted by the regulator in the UK. In the US, you may have other money transmission rules. You have the BitLicense approach from New York, all very different. And none of those regimes were built from the ground up specifically for this particular sector. So if I talk about what the driving factors were and the hard work that the FSC has done in getting us to this position, it was, let's build a ground-up framework that is evolutional, so not the BitLicense type approach of conducting a 500-page document that governs the way that something needs to operate, a principles-based approach with guidelines that can obviously themselves evolve over time. But the driver of all of this is to say, this is a regime that's built for this particular industry, that's relevant for this particular industry, and that's built from the ground up, as opposed to saying, well, you theoretically could trigger something that exists within a payment institution type license, but large swathes of that regulation are actually kind of irrelevant to this type of business. So the instigator and the driver of this initiative, I think, was to try to get to that stage. And I think we are definitely seeing the response to that already. So I hope that's a basic enough overview, but.
Well, I think part of the message there is the fact that you're talking about a trinity of bodies there. You have industry, government, and the regulator who have sat down to say, can we find a solution to this problem?
Absolutely, and we do take a lot of these things for granted in Gibraltar, but I can tell you there are lots of engagements. Forget about even the payment institution point. The concept of a derivative or a CFD or a financial instrument varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and regulator to regulator. So the attraction of a Gibraltar in that scenario is to say, well, this is our product, this is our service, and being able to engage or go through a pre-engagement process to absolutely define the relevant licensing regime and give certainty around that is a hugely attractive and actually quite unique position. So that is the driver for a lot of the movement that we're seeing at the moment, I think.
Thanks, Jerry. Well, look, I think you mentioned a point that a lot of other jurisdictions are talking about this, but haven't quite actually rolled out a framework yet. The four of us have been on the road for many, many years, going around talking about Gibraltar, and we know that historically there may not have been so much interest as there has been recently. Anthony, maybe you could kick off with, in terms of Gibraltar as a world leader in terms of regulatory framework, could you give an example of your experience, probably going back to early 17, that you've seen coming in terms of interest into your company and some of the things that you've witnessed?
Sure. So, early 17 is when we started to get some interest, finally. I think all of us here, sitting down here on the panel, have sort of been in this from an early day. 3 years in crypto is 20 years in any other industry. So, and obviously there was a lot of going to conferences, trying to build up contacts in this space, trying to sort of inform them of what Gibraltar is doing. 3 years ago in the crypto conferences, Gibraltar, nobody knew what Gibraltar was, where Gibraltar was, or anything to do with the sort of regulatory framework we were trying to put together. So, obviously that's very different today. And in the last 12 months, I would say, is when really we started getting a lot of, inquiries, calls from people who maybe I had met 2 years ago, 3 years ago, saying, look, we've heard about what's going on in Gibraltar, we want to know more. And, what is this license? How can we get ourselves, a DLT license? And then what is the application process? So obviously that's now up and running. So if you want to apply for a license, you can today. And so far, I have to say the experience of the application process has been good. The feedback I get from clients is a favorable one. They all, love the fact that they can come here, sit down with a regulator, and have an open discussion as to what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve, what is the best way, first of all, do I need a license? Because, and the interesting thing is in this space that most people now I see want licenses actually, especially in the exchange and platform sector, because they want to give that. They want to show their customers that they are trustworthy, that there is somebody looking at what they're doing and making sure they're doing everything right. So yeah, I must say that the process so far has been very good, and the feedback I've got from clients also very good.
We're very fortunate. It's sometimes better to be lucky than smart, and we're very fortunate to be in a jurisdiction that's been as forward-thinking, I think, as it has been to date, and that's given us, I think, a unique first-mover advantage. Jay, perhaps from Tri-Eye's perspective and your own personal perspective, could you also tell us, May the framework was announced at the university. October, we were here in this room when actually Sean and Nikki stood on stage and laid out the regulatory framework in terms of detail for the first time. What have you experienced since then?
I mean, the important thing for Jeb has been to, I think, learn from our experience in innovating in other sectors. There's been mention of online gaming this morning. I think it's interesting to draw some analogies with that. The key for Jeb is also the regulator. We've heard from Sean and William this morning, and it's I think for this sector it's particularly important to have a regulator that understands the business, and the FSC and government, I think, have invested a lot to ensure that that's the case. Our experience to date has been, I think, very similar to Joey's and Anthony's, an incredible amount of interest, a lot of applications going through, the process with the regulator, and also, interestingly, how it's placed Gibraltar on the map generally in respect of not just crypto, but it's really raised the profile once again and has started to remind people that Gibraltar is open for business and ready to innovate.
It's interesting, when we're out there on the road, we do talk about 25 years ago, and Albert Isla mentioned it this morning, the minister, that 25 years ago Gibraltar was, a first mover in terms of, the gambling industry was moving from shops to telephones, and they were looking for, remote legislation, and Gibraltar basically put itself as a first mover. So we have previous experience, and I think, Joey, what do you see as we'll get into the individual applicants in a moment, but as a jurisdiction, obviously, we focus on distributed ledger technology licensing regulations. We're not trying to regulate crypto here, and there's often a confusion out there when you're in the world, and people say, oh, you're trying to regulate Bitcoin. So, well, that's actually really tough. But in terms of the challenges for the jurisdiction as we move forward, particularly with regulators trying to wrestle with what we see, what do you see the landscape?
I think there are a couple of points probably to that. I mean, the first is, you mentioned sort of historically looking back on the gaming side of things, which is relevant. I think forward-looking is also very important. So when people talk about AMLD5 and sort of new AML-type rules that are coming that could capture certain exchange or wallet-type activity, our position is, well, that's already covered within our DLT framework, and it's already forming part of our law today. I think the interaction between that universe and the banking universe is absolutely critical. We've seen the FCA in the UK issue a public statement asking for clearer and more banking support to developing this community. I think 1 or 2 days ago in Israel there was a Supreme Court decision sort of enforcing a certain bank to continue to operate in a certain way with a certain Bitcoin provider because it was meeting certain standards, and that exists on that side of things as well. But I mean, I think DLT for us and what it does is not to capture. It is effectively technology neutral. It captures this concept, high level speaking, of a transfer of storage, a value mechanism. So, I mean, if we look back in time and you think about the disasters that have existed in this universe, and if you use let's just say a Mt. Gox as an example, that is, not the technology, it had nothing to do with Bitcoin itself. It had something to do with that external party that was conducting a role in respect of people who wanted to transact in that universe. Now, the largest exchange in the world was effectively run by two guys or whatever it was, and one of them was ill, and that universe and the entire price, collapsed around that event. So from our point of view, it's not about regulating the underlying technology. It's saying if you're a counterpart, an intermediary, if you're a service provider, if you're providing a facility to assist anything, not just in the Bitcoin universe, but in the entire universe, then you need to operate to a certain standard. And I would say, actually, what I find quite amazing is some groups trying to intentionally be caught within the framework and try to demonstrate that they are hitting those triggers, because it is so attractive. And as we move, as Chris was saying earlier, more into a kind of retail universe, etc., these issues become more and more and more and more critical. So, and I do genuinely think that we're ahead of the curve on that side of things. So
challenges to the jurisdiction, gents. Do you want to add any further comments in terms of how you see and what Gibraltar needs to do during 18, 19, and 20?
Yeah, I think one of the key challenges is going to be how other jurisdictions respond to operators, DLT providers who have licenses here in Gibraltar and maybe offering services, providing services. Obviously, this is online, so this is the online space, so it's going to be pretty much worldwide. Most people want to provide services everywhere in the world, provided that they can legally. So it's going to be interesting to see now how other jurisdictions respond to that, whether or not they sort of fast track their thinking on how they want to regulate this sector. Obviously we saw, going back to the similarities with gaming, we saw that happen then. when initially Gibraltar was starting to provide services everywhere, just because they could, and there was nobody telling them otherwise, until people started to say, well, actually, you need a license here if you want to operate here as well, or if you want to provide services here. Actually, the US went a step further and said, actually, you can't provide services here. So it's going to be, I think, interesting to see how this develops.
So a couple of curveballs. Let's talk about two words beginning with B, banks and Brexit. So we've got a great framework that's currently, in legislation. Jay, I get asked all the time, so how are the banks in Gibraltar? And do you have the support to enable fintechs to look at this as a jurisdiction?
I think we've been very fortunate in that sense that the banking industry, or some of the banks, have started to provide services to the DLT sector. It would be great to see more banks providing that, but I think we're already ahead of some of the other jurisdictions which have some serious banking issues. Joe, you mentioned the FCA publicly requesting that the banks provide services to the industry. So, I mean, I think we're quite fortunate in that sense that they've followed. The guys working within those banks also understand the industry. And that certainly helps when trying to go through the process of opening bank accounts for those businesses.
So, Joe, I guess that leaves you with Brexit. How's Brexit going to affect, not Gibraltar, but how is it going to affect what we're doing in the fintech space? Because if I was an issuer or a corporate looking to possibly domicile here and apply for a license, it would be a burning question that I would need answered. What are your thoughts on that?
To be honest, I don't really think it's, high level, I don't really think that it's an issue in this space at all. So, Anthony mentioned the gaming space. There still is no pan-European regime that exists from a gaming perspective. If we look at, I suppose, the most similar, let's talk about crowdfunding regimes and initiatives that exist in lots of different jurisdictions. There is no pan-European framework either, although there's been an attempt to develop one over about 8 years. That still has not matured. So a service provider in London, in that respect, cannot passport and offer those services into Germany automatically. It's exactly the same on the gaming side of things. And I cannot imagine, there have been some, I think the CEO of Deutsche Bank or something recently who came out saying that governance was the key point, and they estimated a time frame of 8 to 10 years for the EU to try to develop something in the space. So I don't really see it as, in this sector, I wouldn't answer this exactly the same if it was a specific, let's say, banking license type passportable activity that was necessary. In this space, I just don't think that actually exists. That's not to say that people are not going to understand what is required to provide services in different jurisdictions, but they also need to understand the extent to which they are actually providing services in different jurisdictions. An example might be today a crypto-based exchange in Luxembourg, regulated under an EU framework. I can open an account with them. They are not passported into Gibraltar because it's not relevant for that type of engagement and activity. So I don't think that, you could ask this exact same question to an exchange or platform that was based in Switzerland, not part of the EU, in Singapore, not part of the EU, in the US, not part of the EU. So I don't really see it in this particular space as a high-level concern. That's my line on that only. And just to add one point on the banking side of things, there's a lot of evolution in the space. I think that the banks are understanding more and more. You're seeing what some of the Japanese banks are doing. There are banks in lots of different jurisdictions, obviously including Gibraltar, that are looking at the technology that is available to them from a transaction monitoring point of view, from an AML perspective. The coin firms of the world who are being able to run certain projects and systems and control mechanisms over those particular businesses, that is not something that exists in the fiat universe. It just doesn't exist. So I expect that to continue to evolve and develop. But we are definitely in a very, very, as Jay said, in a very fortunate position today.
Yeah, as we all know, it's actually not the banks, it's the correspondent clearers that seem to be providing the challenges, right? So I think when we get the AML and KYC challenges that they need to overcome, then we'll see the correspondent clearers and Jamie hopefully become a little bit more supportive.
I think the final point, just on the FSC side of thing, again, not to sort of regurgitate the same thing, but what I've found in the past is if you have a direct engagement with a large regulator, I won't use any one in particular, but the BaFins and FINMAs and MASs, etc. of the world, I've used a few. The interesting thing is they always have very smart teams who are very experienced in this space, and they tend to try to sandbox or deal with this all separately. The interesting thing with some of the large regulators is that then when you try to deal with an authorizations team, they've never even heard of blockchain. And the big difference here is that you're dealing with an expert group of people on a pre-engagement type phase, but when you're going through a process, you're also dealing with people who understand the space. Again, it's something that we take for granted, but it genuinely is unique. So I think that's definitely a positive.
Okay, so let's get on to potential applicants, because there could be a few in the room. So Anthony, can you just give us perhaps a little bit of advice and direction, and perhaps some of the challenges which applicants may need to consider? That'd be really useful, some of the thoughts that you have.
Yeah, one of the main challenges, I think, or perhaps not a challenge, but certainly something that applicants need to focus on and consider, is who they're going to have on the ground in Gibraltar. That is something that really, you can, of course, bring people over, relocate them to Gibraltar. That is something that some of our clients, we see some of our clients doing. But also others are, in fact, looking for, to hire people over here who are already working in Gibraltar. And that is not easy to do. I mean, and a lot of them look to me to sort of provide them with potential candidates. And of course, most good people here already are in good jobs. So it needs to be a pretty good offer to lure them into this new world. Plus, I think although we are developing a little bit of an ecosystem now with where a lot of people now are starting to really get into cryptocurrency, generally blockchain and this world. I think that will develop over time, and as it did with the gaming sector. But that is one of the key things that I think people need to think about seriously. You can't just have your operation based out of UK, Ukraine, anywhere else, and have sort of a pawn here. Somebody here who really doesn't understand the business.
Mind and management, basically.
Exactly. You need to have mind and management here. And that is one of the things that, although we always say from day one, people seem to sort of skirt around and they don't seem to want to tackle it until really the application stage, and then that slows down the whole process. So that is one of the things I think that people need to really focus on.
Good advice. Jay?
I'd add the transition over to being regulated can be a little bit of a shock as well to some people. A lot of these businesses are either startups or were startups not that long ago, and have grown exceptionally quickly. And making that transition over to getting regulated and complying with the necessary standards, ensuring that the right processes and procedures are in place, that can be a little bit frustrating for the applicant. And that's, I guess, pre-application. It's working with the advisors to make sure that all of that is in place before the application is submitted. So my advice would be patience, I guess.
Yeah, I think though some of the forward thinking was, for for us that live in the EU under MiFID or MiFID II, that is what's the technical expression? A ball ache, I think, is probably how I would describe it. So having a principles-based system as the regulator was actually so forward-thinking and not so prescriptive. But I mean, Joey, do you want to sort of provide some advice on that front?
No, I mean, I was just going to say I mean, obviously all of these are relevant points. I mean, from a mind and management perspective, that's a critical factor. But I think what's also interesting is, definitely the FSC have published guidelines around outsourcing, et cetera, for years, and they understand the way that interactions can work between a group entity or entity that's supported from Silicon Valley or Hong Kong, wherever it might be. That's not to avoid the point that Antti was saying, that absolutely minor management and the key sort of 4 I's principle, etc., that's applied to any of our financial services practices will apply to this one. That is absolutely clear. But a universal worldwide organization can continue to operate in that way. What I would also say in terms of challenges, high level, is that the concept or what this regulation covers, the transfer or storage of value mechanism, or transfer or storage of value by way of business, just the interpretation of what that means, that it sounds very straightforward and simple. It isn't always that straightforward or simple. And I suppose, as a very silly example, I could use the classic sort of centralized versus decentralized type exchange activity, and to what extent is the decentralized platform triggering any of these requirements? It depends on lots of different factors that need to be considered. So moving forward, I expect that there will be a natural evolution of all of these concepts, and like in any new regime, there are going to be interpretations that evolve as well over time. So I would say that that's a critical and important starting point.
Okay, thank you. So Pete, I think it would be maybe appropriate if anybody has any questions of the guys here. Now's the opportunity. So.
Hi, Eran Shai from Benefit Business Solutions. I'm sure, gentlemen, between you guys, you've been advising quite a few applicants already. From what you've been seeing so far, has there been any trend in the categorization that the FSC has taken with respect to the different applicants? So that, for example, exchanges, from what you've seen, fall under one sort of categorization, or companies that are only transmitting value rather than holding it have been categorized differently, or has everyone been category 3 so far, type of thing?
I think the applications are being dealt with. So the intention was never to have a one-size-fits-all. So they have very much been dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's hopefully going to be the intention going forward. A little bit of a vague answer, but I don't know if you guys...
I think that's what, I think
All of mine have been category 3. I'm looking at the regulator now to see if...
Yeah, I mean, I would just a high level. I mean, obviously, I don't think it will always be the case that every single one type of activity falls within one type of category. It will depend, I imagine, on lots of other factors around that, but it will be absolutely case by case, and maybe it will be a whirlwind into Cat 3. But yeah.
Thank you.
Whoops, hang on, the regulator wants to ask a question. Well, that's
Well, moving on.
This is going to be expensive. I think it's coffee break already, so I really have run out of time, Pete. You've got to stay on track with this conference.
I think maybe just in response to kind of to that point in the categorization, we have actually categorized as 2 and 3s as well. But I think it's going back to the point I made earlier on the detail that you need to provide at the authorizations. Each exchange is very different in the way they actually do it. So obviously the risks associated, inherent risks and complexity associated with that business model would obviously vary. So yeah, hopefully we haven't seen any Cat 1s for now, which are maybe on the simpler category, but yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, William.